When was the last time you were really annoyed by your boss? How did that make you feel? Or did your superior maybe even berate you once, leaving you despaired, angry, or hopeless? I'm sure these were very unpleasant moments for you. But at the end of the day, you got to go home and vent to a partner or friend, I presume. Now, imagine what the consequences of such behavior could be if it was displayed in a cockpit of a large airliner carrying over 100 people. Spoiler alert, it might end in disaster. Today, we are going to take a look at the astonishing case of Air Blue Flight 202. Welcome to airspace. Now let's get to the story. Air Blue is an airline currently operating 12 aircraft out of Pakistan. On July 28, 2010, Air Blue Flight 202 was scheduled to take 146 passengers and 6 crew members from Karachi to the nation's capital of Islamabad. That day, the cockpit was shared by a 60-year-old captain and a 34-year-old first officer. Shortly after takeoff at 7:41 in the morning, a flight attendant entered the cockpit and served the pilots some breakfast. Apparently, the captain thought that this was the perfect time to check the operational and technical knowledge of his first officer by asking detailed questions about various topics. Mind you, this was an ordinary flight and not a check ride, but still, the captain went ahead. When the first officer was unable to answer each and every one of his questions to his liking, the captain furiously berated his first officer by, quote, using harsh words and a snobbish tone, contrary to the company's procedures and norms. This game of check questions and verbal abuse continued for about an hour, during which the first officer understandably became more and more withdrawn and passive. After the intermittent humiliating sessions, the first officer generally remained quiet, became underconfident and submissive. With this terrible atmosphere in the cockpit, the pilots soon reached the greater Islamabad area. To gather all information needed for their approach, the first officer checked the ATIS, that is the airport information, if you will. It contains information about the weather and runway news at the airport concerned, Islamabad. Unfortunately for the pilots, rainy weather with impaired visibility was reported at their destination. Usually, pilots would land on runway 30 using the instrument landing system there, which would have enabled them to easily find the landing runway. Unfortunately, due to the prevailing wind at the time, the crew had to plan an approach to the opposite runway, runway 12. Now, let's take a quick look at Islamabad's airport. As I said, it has an instrument landing system for the approach to runway 30. But as you might notice, it lacks an approach aid for the opposite runway, runway 12. This is due to the high terrain surrounding the airport, which makes a normal approach design impossible. Therefore, the pilots had to use another procedure to approach the airport, a so-called circling approach. Circling approaches are flown by first using an approach aid, in this case, the instrument landing system of runway 30. Then, at a certain altitude called the minimum descent altitude, the aircraft will level off and break away from the approach path. A downwind leg is then flown and finally, the pilots will perform a turn towards the opposite runway they originally approached. During the whole circling approach, the runway environment must be kept in sight by the crew. This is a rather demanding procedure for pilots for various reasons. First and foremost, circling approaches are rare, so most of us don't have a lot of experience flying these approaches. Therefore, an extensive briefing and close adherence to procedures is required. And finally, circling approaches are often conducted in bad weather. This was also true for Air Blue 202. The surface visibility was reported to be just 3.5 kilometers, which is just barely above the minimum required 2.4 kilometers for this approach. The captain seemed unperturbed by the news about the bad weather. But here, things started to get strange. Instead of briefing the standard procedure for the upcoming circling approach, the captain had the idea of ordering the first officer to program a path to the runway in the flight management system. To do this, the first officer had to enter so-called PBD points, which stands for place, bearing, and distance. PBD points are defined by choosing a point, defining a direction in degrees and a distance to said point, which results in another waypoint the crew can potentially use. In this case, the captain's idea was to use a point abeam of the threshold of runway 30, combined with another point at the end of the downwind leg and a point in space called CF, or center fix. This CF point is automatically generated by the flight management system if a runway is entered that has no instrument approach procedure. It is just a point 5 nautical miles out on the extended runway centerline. This resulted in a path that vaguely resembles the circling approach path they were intending to fly. The captain then told the first officer that he wanted to fly this circling approach in the nav mode, essentially telling the aircraft to just follow the pilot-constructed path to the runway. But the captain's idea and behavior should have raised an eyebrow in the first officer, and it probably did. First, flying such a specific circling approach in the nav mode is not permitted. After the flight crew leaves the instrument landing system, the approach must be performed either manual or in heading or track mode. Second, the captain planned and ordered the first officer to fly a downwind leg on the southern side of the runway. This is not allowed, as is clearly stated on multiple areas on the approach chart that says, "Avoid overflying city," and also shows a prohibited area exactly where the captain would have planned his approach path. And lastly, the approach path the captain had intended would have taken the flight out of all defined tolerances. You see, the approach design grants the absence of terrain and obstacles within a protected zone around the airport. This zone is defined by intersecting circles centered at each runway end, measuring 4.3 nautical miles. Also, remember that the visibility was just 3.5 kilometers, or in other words, 1.9 nautical miles. By flying so far away from the airport, the crew was guaranteed to lose visual contact to the runway. Despite all these red flags, the first officer did not speak up, either because he did not realize the captain's mistakes, or maybe because he was simply too intimidated. When the aircraft then approached Islamabad, the first officer asked air traffic control for an ILS approach, followed by a circling on the left side of the runway. Promptly, he was reminded by the controller that a circuit on the left side of the runway was not allowed, and the crew should fly on the right side of the runway due to local restrictions. The captain insisted a few times that the first officer should ask to fly on the left side, but air traffic control rightly declined every time until the captain finally gave in. He then ordered the first officer to once again program an approach path, but this time to the right side of the runway. The latter did as ordered and entered the PBD waypoints into the flight management system. Now, the aircraft was in its descent on the instrument landing system. First, the captain correctly entered the correct minimum descent altitude of 2,500 feet into the autopilot altitude window, but then suddenly lowered the altitude to 2,000 feet, probably in anticipation of the bad weather. Here, he was promptly reminded by the first officer that this was a violation of procedure and that the altitude should be 2,500 feet. Begrudgingly, the captain reverted his selection back to 2,500 feet. After this, the aircraft tracked towards a beacon called Romeo November, which acts as the missed approach point for this approach. In other words, the crew is allowed to continue flying at 2,500 feet until they reach Romeo November. Latest at this beacon, the runway must be in sight in order to continue the approach. If the pilots are unable to locate the runway by this time, a go-around has to be performed. As the aircraft flew level towards Romeo November, the tower controller informed the crew that another aircraft had just managed to land successfully. An information that, while probably meant to calm the crew, might have put undue pressure upon them. What the tower controller failed to communicate to the pilots was the fact that said aircraft had managed to land only during the third attempt, and another aircraft even had to divert due to the bad visibility. But it seemed that the pilots of Airblue 202 were lucky. Shortly before Romeo November, they spotted the runway. At this point, the captain ordered the plane into a right turn at a heading of 352 degrees, using the autopilot's heading function. So far, so good. As the plane was turning right, the tower controller also advised the crew to perform a bad weather circuit, probably hinting to the pilots to keep the aircraft as close to the field as possible in order not to lose sight of the runway. To this suggestion, the captain only muttered, "I'll let him say what he wants to say," and continued flying straight ahead, away from the airport, and descended the aircraft to 2,300 feet. This is a violation of the minimum descent altitude, but this time the first officer did not speak up. As the aircraft was tracking away from the runway, the captain made one last adjustment to the aircraft's heading and then engaged the navigation mode. This brought the aircraft on course to the PBD-11 waypoint the first officer had created. Clearly, the captain didn't intend to follow company procedure, but instead he tried to fly his own, self-constructed circuit to the runway. At this moment, the aircraft left the protected zone of 4.3 nautical miles around runway 12. Instead, it started heading straight towards Margala Hills, a mountain range north of Islamabad. Trying to intervene, the first officer asked, "Sir, are you visual?" To which the latter responded, "Visual, huh? Okay." Don't ask me what he meant by that, and apparently the first officer also decided to leave it at that. For a few moments, the aircraft continued northwest until air traffic control intervened, since the aircraft was approaching a restricted area. Tower instructed the crew to turn left immediately. At the same time, the aircraft's ground proximity warning system started to issue the first terrain warnings, indicating that the aircraft was in grave danger. Pilots should never hear this warning in normal operation, and if they do, they should react promptly by stopping whatever they are doing and correcting the flight path immediately, usually by pulling the aircraft up and climbing steeply. But the captain did nothing of the sort and just continued as he had done before. The first officer then intervened frantically and said, "Sir, the higher ground has reached. Sir, there is terrain ahead. Sir, turn left." Now the captain can be heard on the cockpit voice recorder sounding very stressed and jittery. He probably became overwhelmed and task saturated. Meanwhile, the aircraft's path remained unchanged. At this point, the tower controller called the aircraft and asked whether they were still visual with the runway. Distressed, the first officer asked the captain what his response should be, and when the captain said nothing at first, the two pilots simultaneously transmitted, "Airblue 202, we are visual with terrain." Meanwhile, the ground proximity warning system continued to issue terrain warnings. The first officer became more and more anxious and warned the captain, "Sir, terrain is coming." Finally, the captain reacted and said, "Yes, we are turning." He grabbed the heading selector of the autopilot and started turning it to the left. But here, he made one very crucial mistake. Remember how the captain engaged the navigation mode in order to bring the aircraft on course to the waypoint PBD-11? This navigation mode was still active, since the captain only turned the heading selector, but he never pulled it to actually move the autopilot from navigation to basic heading mode. Essentially, he just kept turning and turning the heading selector, thus pre-selecting a heading for later use. As he kept turning the selector, he finally reached a selection of 086 degrees. Here, he finally realized that he had not pulled the selector to engage the heading mode, and that the aircraft had remained in the navigation mode. He tried to correct his mistake by pulling on the selector. Now, the autopilot switched to heading mode. But remember, the aircraft is now heading in a direction of 300 degrees, and the selected heading is 086 degrees. The shortest way for the autopilot to reach this target is with a right turn, not with a left turn as the captain had intended. Fatally, the aircraft now started a right turn, further into high terrain. The ground proximity warning system now increased its warning intensity from mere terrain ahead to terrain ahead, pull up warnings. Whenever a pull-up warning is issued, pilots should immediately do as the warning system says. Pull back the side stick all the way, at full power, and try to save everyone's life by climbing into the sky. Had the pilots done this, there is a real chance that the aircraft could have been saved. But alas, the captain just continued while the first officer pleaded, "Sir, turn left. Sir, pull up. Sir, pull up." What followed after that can only be described as utter confusion by the captain. He proceeded to add more thrust, then reducing it, he pitched up, then down, he tried turning left and right, and at one point he even stepped into the rudder harshly, which led to the aircraft banking sharply to the left. Residents of Margalla Hills saw the aircraft racing overhead at a very low altitude, as low as a 4-story building, as one of the eyewitnesses described. During this wild ride, the first officer continued pleading to the captain, but he never actually took control of the aircraft. The final thing that can be heard on the cockpit voice recorder before the inevitable impact was, "Sir, we are going down. Sir, we are going down." Then the aircraft crashed into Margalla Hills, killing all 152 people on board. Pakistani authorities investigated the accident and published a final report about a year after the crash. It would be one of the shortest, most incomplete reports the aviation community had ever seen, spanning only 38 pages. Usually, these reports are very detailed and hundreds of pages long, but this one was not. Essentially, the report more or less just describes the chronological sequence of events that happened on that fateful day. It also notes the many procedural errors committed by the captain and the first officer's failure to intervene. Above all, though, it mentions that the captain's harsh and berating tone most probably inhibited and intimidated the first officer,